This is another application for the running stitch. In this application, I'm going to use it, I'm looking for the right size needle for this. I'm going to use my running stitch as thread tracing. So thread tracing, as it might suggest, is a replacement for pencil tracing. So I've just cut a half scale pattern piece from my half scale mannequins, and this is the front piece of a blouse with a single dart coming up diagonally from the bottom. Now I want to cut it out of the fabric, and this green, let's just say it is the finished fabric that I'm going to cut this piece out. Now this pattern piece is minus its seam allowances, so these cut edges represent the sewing line, and these items here that look like an arrow are darts. There's the center line of the dart and there's the seam line of the dart. I'm just going to do half of it, so this has more detail on it. As you can see, this is full of pencil lines and it has a lot of information on it. It has a center line drawn down the center and a C with a little L, which represents my center line, which corresponds to this line on the fabric that I didn't draw on. It's just threaded. And these are measurement lines. This is the bust line and this is the waist line, so I keyed in what areas this is. Now, when I cut it out of the fabric, ready to sew, I need to transfer this information onto the good fabric, not using a pencil and not using any tracing paper. We're just going to thread trace. So we're going to use the running stitch to thread trace. And when I cut it out, after I thread traced it, then I will make sure to leave sufficient seam allowance for whatever finished seam I plan to use. Okay, so here we go. Let's put this out of the way. Scissors out of the way. I start with my knotted thread and begin beyond your edge and just use your running stitch and use the stitch as close together as necessary to get the information onto the second or onto the under layer, which is the good fabric, right along that edge. So I'm tracing my pattern with thread onto the fabric. Now thread tracing is always done in a single layer of fabric. So you're thinking, how am I doing this? Well, I've inserted some cardboard underneath my top layer so that I don't go through too far. And it's a bit awkward sewing backwards like this against myself, but if you were working on a full-size piece, you would make sure that it's at the right place. Now I go beyond the end and I start again above and come down. Now if there are curves, then your stitches will be shorter to create the curve. If there's a longer stretch that you can identify the seam line, then your stitches can be slightly longer. And you would do that for the whole pattern piece. Now the other thing I might just point out to you, that the center line that I've marked on my pattern piece is done with pencil, and I've superimposed it on the center line of the fabric so that I know it's on true grain, which is another piece of information that we add to pattern pieces, is we put arrows to show the true grain. That is the warp grain of the fabric. So any information that I want to transfer from my pattern piece to my actual working piece, I can do with thread tracing, a combination of thread tracing and tailor's tacks, which I will go through in another video session, what tailor's tacks are. Tailor's tacks are a method of transferring information from one level of fabric through to underneath level. So you transfer information from the top and you transfer it down through without making permanent marks. So again, thread tracing is a temporary technique of transferring information from one pattern piece to the fabric that you intend to actually sew with. You said, well, why don't I just pin it on and cut out right around it straight away? Why do I need to have this information? Well, this piece is fairly straightforward, as you can see, but there are instances in couture sewing especially where there are more layers of information that need to be transferred at one time. And perhaps you, which happens often as well, is that you're thinking about how you're going to position all of your pattern pieces on the fabric to get the best layout. So, and the other thing is, when we've cut it out, you still have that information here which represents your sewing line. Now, I haven't transferred my waistline, my dart, or my bust line through yet. That's another video. I'm going to show you how to do the tailor's tacks, but for now I will just carry on, finish tracing this pattern piece. And if you've never seen a pattern piece before, then it will look a little bit unfamiliar to you. If you have seen pattern pieces before in sewing, then you will recognize that this is the front half of a blouse. It doesn't have enough information to tell you whether it has sleeves or whether it is sleeveless, but what I'll just point out in a second here when I finish this thread tracing. Oops, I lost my thread. That happens quite a lot too. If the hole is much larger than your thread, then the thread tends to slip out of your needle if you pull too far. Ideally, perhaps the eye of the needle could be a little bit smaller for this application. Right. Okay, so you've seen I've started with a knot, ended with a back stitch because I can easily remove them. So this represents the neckline. These are the shoulder seams. These are the armhole, a side seam, a side dart, and the bottom hem of this blouse. So that is thread tracing. Now, I can show you what information I've transferred so far. So now you can see there is the pattern piece. When we're ready to cut it out, I will add my seam allowance. Now, I do have a half scale measuring tape that I can use, but for these purposes, I'm just going to show you that I have a piece of cardboard that's roughly half the width of my tape measure, which represents, to scale, the amount of seam allowance. Now here I can use a pencil once I've absolutely made certain that I'm going to be cutting along the pencil line. Before that, no pencil lines, no pens at all. But I use my cardboard as my measure for my cutting line. So as I cut out my pattern piece, I can just follow the pencil lines. So I'm following my sewing line and creating my seam allowance just using a template. We use templates quite a lot. We make our own templates. There's nothing that's ready-made about it. This is a piece of cardboard and it's sliced straight. How simple is that, and how inexpensive is that? So a lot of this you can use for your home sewing projects with very little investment in tools. Okay, so now here my next step would be to actually cut along, just following those pencil lines, and I've had my pattern piece cut out. So thread tracing not using a pencil but thread tracing is another application for the running stitch. Here at the school, what we have for practicing drafting and practicing measuring and trying out designs, we have these half-scale mannequins. These are full-scale measurements in half size. They may look a little bit smaller than half size, but that's exactly what they are. And because we use them as often as we do, the school has designed and created these half-scale measuring tapes. Rather than using a full-scale measuring tape and then halving every measurement, we actually use these half-scale measuring tapes, which makes life so much easier. As you can see, I can just use this half-scale measuring tape to get the accurate measurements scaled in half. So if I were to measure side seam to side seam on my mannequin, I would come up with 51 centimeters, which is the same as 51 centimeters on my measuring tape. So these half-scale mannequins do come in different sizes. They're limited in the amount of sizes they come in, but for demonstration